Hey crafters, welcome back to my channel Because I'm Crafty. My name's Katelyn, and today I'm going to show you guys how to take in a jean waist with a flat felled center back seam. If you guys haven't watched the first video in this series, I show you guys how to take in a pair of jeans that has a serged center back seam. So if you're unsure of how to unpick your jeans, check out that video first. But in this one I have already taken it apart and I've already marked where they need to come in. And I'm just marking my seam allowance and my stitch line so that I know how much I need to trim off and where I need to sew. So with a flat felled seam, you have seam allowances that are pushed in opposite directions. Usually a ½ inch is a normal seam allowance for a flat felled, and what they do is they overlap one another so that they are top stitched down and both sides are caught. So it's a little bit tricky to explain, but I hope you can understand once you watch this video and see the finished result. And if you take a look at a pair of jeans that you already own, I'm sure you can figure out what I mean. But as you can see, the left side here is folded to the underside, and the right side of your screen, the seam allowances is going to be folded towards the right side of your fabric. So after I have cut off the excess seam allowance that I no longer need anymore, I'm going to pin this fold in place so that it's easier for me when I get to the iron and I can make sure that it is as even as possible on both sides. And I want to make sure that I have a smooth transition at the bottom where I'm reconnecting to the original seam line. So I want to make sure that my fold is ironed properly and it has a smooth transition so that it looks smooth once we have it all sewn together. And I also want to make sure that that yoke seam is matched up perfectly because we don't want that to be mismatched once we're finished. So I've also gone ahead and cut my waistband in half at that center back seam. I didn't cut off any extra, I just simply cut it in half after I had it unpicked, and I'm just going to pin it back in place because once I sew it together, that will give me the seam allowance that I need. And do remember, if you have a pair of jeans like these American Eagle ones, where the tag is essentially just embroidered onto the fabric, that will be sewn into your seam. So if you have a pair of designer jeans that you really like the name of and you want to attempt this, just remember that that will disappear into your seam. So don't do it if you really love the jeans and you like the label on the back, if that bothers you. So here over to my iron, as you can see, I'm ironing over that fold that I put my pins in. This way when I go to overlap them over one another, it has a nice crease in it and I can make sure that they're folded over into each other perfectly. This is a really important step to do when making a flat felled seam because you're trying to match it up to the original and make sure that everything lines up, and then when you sew it, you need to make sure it catches it all. So this is an important step to make sure that it's easier and you can be more accurate with your seam. So now I'm removing my pins and I'm going to now do the overlapping process of putting the flat felled together. So basically one side of the seam is going inside the other and then it gets folded down again to be top stitched. So hopefully you can see in this video what I'm talking about. It's a little bit hard to explain and definitely much easier just to watch. And again, with that yoke seam, you really want to make sure that that's matched up so that it is even on the outside once it's all put together. So now I have that first fold all pinned in, and then it's going to get folded over again, and then the seam will be all finished on the inside and the outside. And again, at the bottom where you're matching it up to your original seam line, you want to make sure that that has a smooth fold and transition so that it looks good from the outside and looks like it was never taken in the first place. So once I flip it over to the right side, that's when I do that extra fold over and pin that down so that when it's top stitched, it's all held in place. Something to think about when you do take in the backside of your jeans, depending on if they're blue jeans or distressed in any type of way. A lot of jeans are distressed once they're already made and put together. So if you do take it in, you may lose some of that distressed look. So it may give a different variation in your seam. You may have it look darker at the top than at the bottom because it's been distressed and you've now taken that part away. So depending on the jean that you have, do take that into consideration because if they are really distressed, it may look very weird. So again, it's a personal preference thing, but especially for this pair of jeans, they're not too distressed and they've been worn a lot, so it doesn't really affect the finished look of this pair. So as you can see in the close-up here, it's all folded flat, my yoke lines up, and there's a smooth transition from the original seam line at the bottom, and from the inside it looks finished as well. And then we can take it over to our sewing machine and top stitch all that down. Now this can be a little bit tricky getting it under your machine, and it's also really important to try and match your top stitching thread. For this one, since this color is very bright and random, I couldn't find any top stitching thread, so I've just doubled up my top thread, so I have 2 threads going through my needle, and it just gives it a little bit more thickness to look like top stitching thread. And I'm just going to try and sew that first line on the outer edge of that fold on top as close to the edge as possible, making sure it's as even as it is at the bottom of the center back seam, so it looks as close to the original as possible. And I am sewing over my pins. I'm trying to be really careful. Normally I wouldn't do that, but I need to make sure that the pins hold the other side of the flat felled seam until I am able to come back and sew that portion. And then I'm just scooching down my fabric, and I'm going to do the same step again, but on the other side, and I'm going to try and make sure that I can keep that exact same width from the other stitch line as from the original, so it can look as similar as possible. So you can see from the underside here, when I stitch that other side, it's going to catch that other fold line and hold everything in place. I'm just checking to make sure there's no threads coming out and just trimming everything off so it doesn't get caught in my next round of sewing. And if you need to, like I'm doing here, I'm just taking out those pins that are holding in that flat felled so that I can just make that fold line a little bit more crisp and close to the other seam allowance that's inside of it, just making that fold a little bit smaller to match the original down below. Sometimes in this step you may also need to trim your seam allowance so you can fold it in a little bit further, but it is just a little bit tricky to figure it out and feel around and see what's best for your garment. is a little bit tricky here when you go over that yoke seam because it does have that extra thickness in there from the other flat felled seam. So just make sure to go slowly over that part and make sure that nothing skips or makes any knots as you go over the thickness. And also making sure that it's not moving around too much. And sometimes you may need to go back to unpick a little bit of the original stitching so that your line matches up so it's nice and straight. So you can just go back and adjust that to make sure that it looks like an even straight line all the way up to your waist. And because that inner stitch of the original top stitching is a chain stitch, you also want to make sure that your back tacking is evenly catching that so it's not going to pull out later. So there is my finished flat felled seam, taken in and nice and even. So here I just decided to go over my top stitching one more time, just to give it that added thickness to make it look more like the top stitching. Of course, this is not a required step, this is just more of an aesthetic step. And as you can see, I've already sewn up my waistband, so I'm just going back and pinning it back in the original place so that I can attach it to the pants again. And again with my top stitching, trying to make sure that I can get it back on the same original stitch line so that it looks as close to the original as possible. And this is how the jeans look after they've been sewn back together. And I'm just going to make sure that I put my belt loop back on in the same spot. And I'm just going back and forth a couple times, and I'm just hand wheeling it just to hold it in place a little bit better, since that is a really thick spot. You've got the seam from the center back of the waistband where I had to take it in to match up with the pant part, and then you've got the thickness of the belt loop. So you just want to go slow over that part, making sure not to move it around, and make sure that it lines up with your new center back seam. And I made sure to iron this nice and well at the end, and this is what they look like at the very end. They're nice and tapered at the back. They still have a little bit of extra room, but they fit much better than before. If you guys haven't seen the first video in this series, make sure to check out the first video in this series of how to take in a pair of jeans with a serged center back seam. And the next video I will show you how to add some elastic to the back side of the waistband. So I hope you guys are enjoying this little series on how to alter jeans. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. I hope you guys have a fabulous week, and I'll see you next time, crafters. Bye!